Hey,
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good about yourself.
Pretty good. All right, so do we start?
You can.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Uh-huh. Can you hear me properly, do you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'll start then.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. So a structural adjustment is the wrong policy. That is the motion today. And what I referred structural adjustment is something that it is a set of economic policies that is often introduced as a condition for gaining a loan from the International Monetary Fund, or maybe I'd say World Bank. So this is a kind of state of economic policies. And what they actually do is that um, they imply some stabilization policies and then adjustment measures in the developing countries, or maybe countries that are actually suffering from economic backlash. And then what they do is that they force them to concentrate more on trade and production so that it can boost the economy. And they generally implement free market programs and policies, more like the concept of neoliberalism. And yeah, so it just includes internal changes and especially a lot of trading and all. But countries that fail to enact these kind of programs may be subject to very severe like fiscal discipline. And in fact, the poor countries, which are actually supposed to be taken to heights by these funds, actually just stay the same, or maybe in fact like stay even more poorer in such cases. So just giving a status quo, like many developing nations are in debt and poverty partly due to the policies of international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank today. And this kind of programs like have been like heavily criticized for many years because like there is an increased dependency, like on the richer nations like from a developing nation, because it's more like the idea of foreign investment and all. And the IMF actually they claim that they will reduce poverty, but then no, in fact, like they're actually increasing it, and they have reduced the spending of a country on the things like health, education, development, and the debt repayment and other economic policies. Like they've just been a failure, and in fact the living standard has become like even degraded. So before passing on to you, I'll just let you know that what I'll be talking about today. So firstly, I will be just talking about the economic impact, and then the second would be the exploitation of human and resources. The third would be environmental impact, and um, the fourth, yeah, I think those will be my three arguments. Like those are the areas I'll be revolving around. So yeah, I just passed this mic on to you now.
Okay, cool. Right
Hmm.
on, right on. Okay, I'm getting a little feedback. We'll go ahead. Uh, better stop it. Hold on. Okay, is there any more feedback now? No. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So the resolution today is structural adjustment programs are a bad policy.
Hmm.
I want to start off and state that I'm defining the parameters of this debate as a global good. So the structural adjustment policies are a net positive for the world. Now, the burdens for me as a negative is I'm not going to use a counter policy because I don't necessarily need one at this time. I'm going to use the status quo. Even though there may be issues with it, I think as of right now, it is still the best policy to use. So I'm not going to have an agent of action. Um, so before I get into my case, that's really what I wanted to talk about. I'm not gonna build my case until you've built the case, but I do want to make a statement on structural adjustment programs. that there is a new standard for structural adjustment programs. There are SRAP, structural readjustment programs, that have came out pretty recently that extend the debt repayments and work a lot with the First Nation, whatever you want to call them, the nation that is receiving the loans from the IMF and the World Bank. But I'm not going to talk about that. So I'm going to make this specifically about structural adjustment programs. But I do want the viewers to know that this isn't the end all be all for the World Bank, because even my contentions will most likely have a net negative effect on the countries, but will have a net positive effect for the world. So I do want to make that clear. But yeah, build your case, please.
Okay. All right. So as you said, this is actually the best option we have right now.
Hold
But
on, I can't hear you.
hello.
Something has happened. Oh my god. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Yeah, I got you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
That's fine. Okay. I'll just begin now. Um. So as you said that this is the best option we have right now, but I just like I don't want to actually make this an evidence-based debate, but more like on a principle level. But still, like I'll just state a few things. Like so recently, even the IMF itself like actually agreed to the fact that um, they have actually failed in implementing some of the policies it has actually stated within these structural adjustment programs. And so a lot of other areas are being covered, like the poverty reduction strategy papers. This is the idea that is kind of like replacing structural adjustment right now. This is um, this is a different initiative like than the structural adjustment, but this is kind of like overtaking structural adjustment programs right now, like more into use these days. And yeah, so just not actually moving so much on the evidence here. So I'll just be moving on and just letting you know about the basic on like how the structural adjustment actually affects the society or a country like on a basic level. So I'll just give you an idea. So what happens after structural adjustment is applied? So because like they actually are receiving loans, suppose if a country A is receiving loan from IMF, now they have a certain time where they should actually pay that loan back. Now for that, now since they're already in a condition where they're not economically stable, they actually try to export more in order to raise more money to pay off the debt in the timely manner. But there are so many nations that are now actually being asked or forced into the global marketplace, and because they're economically and socially stable, and then they are told to concentrate on similar cash crops and maybe commodities as others, like because developing countries that they are actually depend more on the commodities like cash crops and all, and even the high like rich nations are actually forced into the global marketplace for those kind of commodities. So now this will actually situation will actually cause a very large scale price war. And then when that happens, the resources from the poorer regions become even cheaper, like which favors the consumers in the West. And now governments they need to increase exports just to keep their currencies stable and just to earn foreign exchange with which they'll help pay debts, and then now what the government therefore must do in its own country is spend less on education, on health, on public sector, degrading the living standard of human beings, and reduce consumption. And what happens is that they consume the products that they do not produce, and then they produce the products that like they do it for export, that they do not themselves consume. So there will be a big problem, and then there will be a reduction in the consumption for themselves. And so many remove or decrease the financial regulations, because just to make sure that they pay the debt well, they actually break so many regulations and like go out of the barrier to actually move it on. And then over time, what happens is that the value of labor decreases, and then social unrest, and it's just like, it's just affecting this in a big level. And then um and yeah, so when the IMF donors keep the exchange rates in their favor, like the poor nations actually remain poorer. And then the financial crisis, I think, like that will like be even more deeper in a country, and then that can be actually blamed on structural adjustment. And yeah, like, if a society spends $100 to manufacture a product within its borders, the money that is used to pay for materials, labor, and other costs that moves through the economy, like within the country. But then now this is a multiplier effect. But then if in case a money is spent in another country, the circulation of that money is within the exporting country. So it's like, it doesn't remain within the country. So it's a big problem already. While the structural adjustment favors the idea of neoliberalism, they function on more foreign investment, foreign trade, and then the domestic income is largely reduced. There's a lot of barriers in that. And then yeah, I'll just be moving to like detailed of these ideas, but you could just proceed now. I give the mic to you. Yep.
Okay, so I think it's best. Hold on. So I think it's best. I was originally going to build a case, like a three contention case, and go through that, but I feel like this is going to be one of those that it's going to be a much deeper statement. So I'm gonna state that everything that you just said is my third contention on why we should stay with structural adjustment policies, right? Okay, so resources from the poor regions become cheaper, which favor consumers in the West. Now, favoring consumers in the West allows for more direct foreign investment into those places. All right, so the governments need to increase exports to just keep their currency stable. Um, that's fine. I'm not opposed to that. Building stability in a country through exports, maintaining their monetary policy, I think that's actually a really good idea. And it's better than the other end, which is to peg to something and then not have full control of your monetary policy. I do like that. So they spend less as a government. I am pro spending less as a government, even for young nation states. I am pro reducing consumption of what that country creates for themselves. I mean, we can take a very classical liberal look at international trade, like the Hector O'Lean model and things of that nature. This country does not need to consume what it creates, right? So it can import and export. It can export what it has as its comparative advantage and import what another country has as a comparative advantage. Therefore, we have gains as a global economy. Not everyone's a winner, but it's a gain for the global economy. Okay, the value of labor decreases. Again, I'm not opposed to this. If because what goes along with the value of labor decreasing and why that happens is because these countries set price controls, whether it be for wages, whether it be for goods, whether it be for products, whether it be for services. One of the things that the structural adjustment policies does is it gets rid of that. And that is a net good. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about what happens in these countries, in the short run, it is an issue because you're upturning and flipping over an entire country's set of standards, right? And it's hard for a country to adjust to immediately. And a lot of these some of the literature and things of that nature, they're very short-sighted. They're within the 3-4 year program, and then they're comparing it to under the program, without the program, and they're seeing negative reflection in the program. But as it longitudinally checks out, these countries are better in the long run. Russia had a loan from the IMF and from the World Bank in 1993, and I don't think that they're at a net negative these days. So yeah, in the short run, I could see that it's a problem, but in the long run, it actually works out better if they stick to these neoliberal policies. So I think we definitely need to take a harder look at this. Um,
Mhm.
and as you've given one contention, I'm going to give a contention real quick. So when they do these SAPs, right, there's higher levels of short run income inequality, right? Now that goes back to what you were talking about, like poverty increases, right? And the income distribution in these countries actually goes pretty south. The income distribution is that increases their Gini coefficient. Poverty headcount ratio seems to become significantly higher in participation countries versus non-participation countries, right? Most people would see this as a net negative. I actually see it as a net positive because when you start building income inequality, you're building into a system that's going to force people to work harder. It incentivizes those at the bottom to get better at the top. If everybody's equal, we have little to no incentive to go to the top. So building income inequality itself from these structural adjustment programs actually makes it better in the long run. Because again, if they get to keep that neoliberal policy statement, they're going to increase because they're actually coming together to get a dominance hierarchy that's different than what it was before, which incentivizes people to do better and to go out and work harder. Now, with that, I'll pass it back.
Okay. All right. So I'll just be putting some rebuttals on the point you actually said. So in terms of like import and export, like as you said, like you are you'd be agreeing to like more experts, like it's good for the country and all, but I'll tell you what the problem in this case is. So in terms of experts, what expert is going from a developing country is a commodity, is a cash crop, like it's a commodity. So when you are importing something, it's a manufactured product because, as I said, like they're not producing what they are consuming, so they are consuming what others are producing. So now they bring a manufactured product as their import, but then they are sending the commodity as export. So this is the problem here, like because commodity is real cheap when it comes to in a comparison with the manufactured product. So that's my problem here. I'm not saying as a like whole, if there's more experts it's a problem for the country, but the problem here is in the comparison, because you're giving commodity and then you are intaking manufactured product, which is very like on a high level. If you see the price is on a high level than the commodities. So that's what the problem is when I say regarding the exports and imports. So talking about how you said like it's good to spend less on a government. Yes. So I'll just talk about this now. So the spending less on a government means that spending less on. So many people are actually depend on the government to actually study, to be benefited from the health sectors, education and everything. Now, spending less on a government means that spending less on health facilities to the people, spending less on education of the people, and not just this because this is associated with a government. Now, since they have to deregulate some of the policies, and a lot of public sector jobs will actually be degraded because they have to actually have more money so that they can actually pay the debt earlier. Let me just be more clear on this one. So what is it that like they're more like the public sector areas will actually be less considered after they are going through a structural adjustment. So when that happens, a lot of people in the public sector as well like will be receiving unemployment facilities as well. And when you talk about this, like you can see there's a condition where you are seeking economical stability, and then there's another condition where there's social stability. So it just depends on it's kind of a ratio. Like you're not giving proper health facilities, education facilities, and to people, and then you want to repay your loan first, and that's your main like primary idea. So yeah, I think social stability is much more required for a country I do agree that economical stability is definitely required, but it's just that it just comes under the comparison, and then social stability is more efficient because if in case you're investing properly in your citizens, they are actually going to invest in you as well. Um, and not just that. I'll just give. Oh, I can hear my sound back. Hello.
Yeah, I got you.
Oh, no, like I mean, I can hear my sound back. It's like an echo. Hello. I can hear myself. And just on a single note that so in these cases like the um so many like wrong trades, I not actually say wrong, but illegal drugs trade, and then everything like this has increased because if you see like the countries that are in debt, they're in a desperation to actually earn the hard cash, because they want to pay their loan, and then so now this kind of illegal crops are grown to just meet the local and immediate needs. And I think this just takes you to two major conclusions. The first one is that the illegal drug trade itself increases because like since hard cash is earned, you actually have more trading of illegal drugs and all. And the second is that now those illegal crops, because you want to on hard cash, you'll invest less on other good crops. So now this illegal crops will divert the land away from meeting the local and immediate needs as well, which could also lead to more hunger. So if you see like this is not so much important, like necessarily important, but still like the condition one a country could actually go through if in case they are actually on a burden to pay their loan. And yeah, I think it's just about policy. Yeah. I just give the mic to you.
Okay, so
Oh, I didn't address.
all right, so I'm going to talk about the exports real quick, and after that, I'm probably not going to talk about it. So the commodity versus the manufactured goods and the difference in price, right? To some extent, I agree, but we have to have a level head here, right? So for one, most of the countries that are going through this standard through the SAPs, they don't necessarily have much manufacturing in the beginning. It's one of their major issues. Secondly, most of these countries are typically led by dictators or other fascistic governments that make it very difficult for manufacturing to become a legitimate task for people. A lot of these countries are agrarian based, and that's not going to help them in this. So I understand that that's a problem, but that's a comparative advantage problem. And it's something that the structural adjustment policies help to fix in the long run by opening up that. And that leads me to my second contention that I'm going to bring up. So the liberal economic ideology or agenda as a precondition for receiving the money, they have to have cutbacks, liberalization of the economy, resource extraction, export-oriented open markets as part of their structural adjustment. So what does that mean? That allows for countries to come in there, right? So direct foreign investment to build an infrastructure for these companies through multinational countries, through multinational companies. That way, they can do better in the long run. So here's some other adjustment policies that also include currency devaluation, because a lot of countries do not handle, proper role of monetary policy. Increased interest rates, which goes along with currency devaluation, which something Nelson doesn't seem to understand, that increased interest rates means you can devalue your currency. He talks about the demand of money that I brought up earlier. Flexibility of the labor market and elimination of subsidies such as food subsidies, right? This makes it attractive to foreign investors when they start getting rid of some regulations and standards are reduced and removed, right? So that's where these countries can focus on these commodity goods for the short run that the West can use until the West can come into these countries and build an infrastructure for them, because a lot of these countries do not have the necessary resources to do it, and they may have natural resources to do it, but they don't have the human capital. For example, Africa. This is going to be a rather brutal statement, and I'm sure it's going to catch some people off, and they're going to be probably pretty mad about this statement. But I want everybody to know the average IQ in sub-Saharan Africa is 85, right? That's a standard deviation from being, I guess you could say, mentally unhealthy. It is really hard for a country with that low level of IQ to build something. And IQ is not something that just changes in a generation, right? It takes time for these to change, right? So let's say after the end of the neoliberal economic era, they may move to a 90 IQ level because they're going to have better education, which doesn't necessarily denote a higher IQ, but they're going to have better food due to GMOs and that movement from the West, and uh, better living standards that comes from that infrastructure being built by these multinationals. But it's still not something they're going to be able to do when there's still a standard deviation and a half from being mentally unhealthy, right? So without the West, I guess you could say, and I don't want to pin it on just the West, but without that coming into these countries and helping and building, these countries cannot do it themselves. So I'm sure you're going to have a statement about resources, but I want to make it unbelievably clear that these resources are useless unless they are being used by someone who can use them. And if they can't be used, then there's no reason for them to even exist if you take it in that manner. All right. So, yeah.
Okay. Um, so in terms of structural adjustment, rather than saying use, I think the more suiting word would be like exploit, because they don't just exploit the human resources, natural resources, but just big things, and I'll actually address all of you, not, yeah, I'll actually address your points as well. So when you say that when the multinational companies come in and then increase the companies and then production within the country, so it's not bad, but the problem is that now the domestic ones are actually backlash because they cannot compete with multinational companies, you see. So the reason behind because they're going through an economic crisis. So if in case like and they are not like strong enough, if you see, so if in case now you push even those multinational companies there, the domestic are not actually going to succeed, and they're not even like going to be able to compete with them. So what happens is that the economic condition is actually just going lower. So what I propose is that the situation, I do agree that the situation a country is going through economic crisis, that's definitely definitely like not a good thing. But then a structural adjustment is not a good solution. I'm not actually going to suggest an alternative, but there are alternatives already coming, like the poverty reduction strategy papers and all. But structural adjustment like has done more bad than good is actually my main idea. As I said, the domestics are left behind, and even the multinational companies that are doing good, because they are a foreign investment, the money they're actually making through it actually goes back to the country, if you see much of their currency, and then it just doesn't do any good to the country, because you are not letting the domestic ones come up, and then you're just exploiting the resources and then taking money to your own country back, and then I don't think it actually does good to the country itself. And talking about currency devaluation, so when SAP, what it actually requires the countries to devalue their currencies against the dollar, and then so what happens is that devaluation makes a good cheaper. It's good. It makes a good cheaper for the foreigners to buy. But the problem is that as I said, export and import. Now theoretically that makes foreign imports more expensive. So it's just that it disrupts the whole idea here. And the next thing this structural adjustment does is that since they have to now have a strict national budget, now they actually try to balance the national budget by raising taxes as well. Sometimes, like, so SAPs, those kind of programs result in deep cuts in programs, like, as I said already, education, health and social care, the removal of subsidies to control the price of basics. And then it's just that, it's more burden on the people. What I actually say is that because they try to balance the national budget by actually raising more taxes from the people itself. And let me just go quickly here. What they do is that, okay, so the regarding lowering the standard of people, like the trade liberation, sorry about that. It actually reduces it reduces domestic industries and increases on unemployment, if you say. And the next is that that actually helps the multinational corporations to actually be benefited, but only the small elites in those developing countries will be benefited, but the poor ones will not be even touched. And the next would be the exploitation of human resources. They have very bad working conditions because they are the one who are actually implementing the policies. So what they do is that they actually have a monopoly on the rule itself. While the first idea is not to have a monopoly over the government, or not have the control over the government, but then SAP actually has been exploiting this area as well. So what they do is that control the government, they actually implement their own policies here, and then they exploit the human resources, very low um, wages, and then very bad working condition. And not just this, like environmental impact, if you see, because the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest waste country, that's what they are doing, because they are in need, they're going to exploit it, they're going to like make huge productions, and then earn hell lot of money, but pollute the resources there, and dump a lot of toxic waste as well. And um yeah, so the personal management, the environmental management is getting weaker and weaker in countries as well, even in Africa, if you see, like in Kenya especially. So the environmental policies, they're at stake, because the programs like this are actually exploiting. And yeah, I think it's just an idea that it's the export when the export promotion increases, there's more extractive activities, there's such as logging and mining, and it's just leading to deforestation, reduction, degradation of land. Like it's just like too much of environmental impact as well. So yeah, that's what I have been revolving around, I would say. That's my point. You could just, yeah, get into yours now.
Okay, so I'm gonna come back to that. So food shortages, I never addressed that. Food shortages because of hard cash needed for illegal crops versus cash crops, right? Um, I guess that's an issue. I am actually kind of pro illegal drugs growing um, in these countries. If they're going to be grown, I would rather them be grown in these countries than mine. And it's actually a pretty good cash crop. I actually think that's one of the few times that I am morally relative to a country. So if a country can make it and do it and sell it, I mean, I'm actually not opposed to that in any manner. So that I'll be okay with, just as long as it goes to the people rather than some tyrannical leader. Okay, multinational companies put out of business domestic companies because they cannot compete. That's fine. Everything that we know about economics says if something cannot compete, then it shouldn't compete. It should not be a part of the economy, right? And I go back to that statement I made about IQ, and I'm an IQ absolutist, right? So if these countries cannot do it, there's no reason for them to do it, at least not yet. Later on down the line, whenever they've moved forward, right? So sub-Saharan Africa has a serious problem. It's very far behind the rest of the world. For it to catch up, it needs help. It can't just do it on its own. That's just one of those sad facts of reality. It was pretty much cut off from the rest of the world during the growth and expansion that the rest of the world had, and now it's time to intervene, right? Well, that's a serious problem because they cannot do it themselves. Um, so I'm not too worried about domestic companies not being able to compete, and specifically because they cannot compete, and I'm okay with that. And it does, and it goes back to the way I define my parameters for what we're talking about is that it's a global good, right? So as of right now, there are issues, structural issues within these countries that happen, but overall, it is a net positive for the world. Now, strict national budget, deep cuts in programs, and raising taxes. Um, I'm gonna make this an analogy towards America, right? So the Republican Party runs on cuts in programs and lowering taxes, right? Well, and not and trying to balance the budget or reduce the budget, right? I actually wish the United States would grab a structural adjustment program, right? So we could have deep cuts in programs and raise taxes. There's a Harvard study done about the Laffer curve for the bottom 50%, right? And that stated that the bottom 50% could pay up to 15% more taxes, right? So we get 70%, a roundabout number of taxes from the top 20% and up, right? But if we had the rest of the people paying another 15% on to what they have and cut programs, we could bounce the budget and go into a surplus for 10 years and use monetary easing and monetary offset to balance that, doing a nominal gross domestic product level target. That would counteract the austerity that the United States has done because the United States has done it. I think after 2010, when don't quote me on the year to be honest, but America did the austerity policy uh, for our fiscal budget, right? And we actually grew our GDP for the first time after coming out of the recession, where we were at like 1%, 1% or so gains. We actually got a 3% gain for a year, and that was using monetary policy easing and monetary offset on fiscal shortages. So you can do it. You just have to be able to do it right. And when you devalue your currency and you raise your interest rates, there's no reason that during that time you cannot inflate your your monetary base enough through nominal gross domestic product targeting in these countries to offset those strict national budgets. That's a failure of their monetary policy. It's not a failure of the structural adjustment program. Labor policies are reduced and have bad working conditions. Look, the World Trade Organization and all of those other places, they have a certain set of labor policies that you cannot go below. As long as they stay within that parameter, there's no reason to say that these are reduced to bad working conditions. Even though there may be anecdotal bad working conditions, the overall goal of the structural adjustment program does not set those conditions themselves. It reduces the labor policies so that more people can have jobs and move away from agrarian society. Because as bad as some of these jobs may sound, I promise you, being in sub-Saharan Africa or in places in Asia where they've also done it, that heat, being in an agrarian society, and that backbreaking work is far more damaging to the body than it would be working in the factory in those bad conditions. So we have to have a comparison there, and that comparison is something that goes to the heart of a lot of these analyses, because they are not comparing apples to apples. They're comparing apples to oranges. They're saying, well, look at our standards, and they should be able to have these standards without actually looking at the structural difference, the infrastructural difference that these countries have. And that's a serious problem when we're trying to analyze these two. Right? So 1900s, America had child labor. That's just something that you're going to have to go through during your industrial to technological revolution. Is you're going to have child labor. It's terrible. It's sad. I wish it wasn't true, but it's just something that has to happen. All right. So if I work in a factory as a kid up to an adult, and I grow and learn my craft, and I'm able to apply it to other jobs, when I have a kid, I will be able to have enough money to put them through school. And that's something that's happened throughout history, through every industrial revolution, into the technological revolution, where we see the age of coming into the workforce moving farther to the older age, right? So that's just something that's just built into that. Last thing I'm going to touch on: environmental policies, dumping waste into the countries which pollute resources. Like that, I disagree with. Again, I don't think that's part of the structural adjustment programs, but that's part of some of the multinationals that come in there. And I'm sure if these countries take them to world court for this, they can actually get a pretty good stop. Now, when we come to strip mining and things of that nature, that's bad, but it's a good overall for the world because those resources get pulled into our technological revolution, which will allow us to move past in the industrial age, which will allow us to push our industrialization to the lower world countries, right? So that's the purpose of that.
All right. So just first entering my last 60 seconds here. Okay, so what my main idea on this is that countries as such are better off a structural adjustment is my idea. Like, it's not that they don't need to, or like they should not opt for any better solutions, but it's just that they are better off structural adjustment because it's doing more bad than good to them. I'm not saying that it's doing no good to them, but it's more that it's doing more bad to them in the comparison. So I'll just give you an example about like how foreign investments are actually exploiting the people, and I think that would be the last thing I'll speak because I just don't have time. So the Coca-Cola company that is actually working in India right now, that's as a part of the foreign investment. What they are doing is that they are actually using the water resources of one singular village, and then so they actually um, they actually use the water of the entire village. They have actually bought it. So what now happens is that um, the people actually who are now like they don't have access to the water resources because the Coca-Cola company actually like went to the government because it is part of a like program. What they are doing is that they're actually going through this and they're actually exploiting the water resources. And now what happens is that the people they're living there are not actually they don't have access to those water resources. And now what the problem is that they now the Coca-Cola company itself, what they are doing is that they are producing water by themselves is their product, and then now they are selling those water bottles to the same people with a price double than what would be a normal one. This is the problem here. They're like actually exploiting the resources, and then it's more like seizing away. So what I mean is that there's a big part of exploitation that exists as a part of structural adjustment programs, and then it's more like not an opportunity help but an opportunity to be benefited, to exploit them. And when you say it's the idea of net good, the net positive, what it seems to me is that um, the richer nations, they go on getting richer, and then the poorer nations, it's just that they go down. As I said, even the people from the developing countries, if in case the elite groups, when the structural adjustment programs come in, the elite groups actually they are benefited in some level, but then the poorer people, they're just getting downwards and downwards. So my main ideas were like about the imports and exports, where I said that the commodities export and the manufacturing products are being imported, and that creates a huge problem because we are spending a lot, and especially you're not producing something, you are consuming, and then that's a huge problem here because it just increases the level of import you have. And spending less on government, decreasing the quality of life itself, not spending on health, education, public sector, decreasing the investment in those. And then like um, yeah, if you see the state of budget education in the in the budget is actually reduced. School related issues like health issues for people, a lot of things here, and exploitation of human resources, low paying job, because it is them who actually implement those policies. Because as I said, SAP, the main problem is that they are controlling the government. If you see in Africa, in a lot of other countries, what the main problem existing is that they're controlling the government itself, which is not a part of the program itself, but then they're exploiting the main idea as well. So I guess that's all because the time is over.